All research, especially when it moves in the sphere of the central question of being, is an ontic possibility of Dasein. The being of Dasein finds its meaning in temporality. But temporality is at the same time the condition of the possibility of historicity as a temporal mode of being of Dasein itself, regardless of whether and how it is a being, in time. As a determination, historicity is prior to what is called history, world historical occurrences. Historicity means the constitution of being of the occurrence of Dasein as such, upon its ground something like world history, and belonging historically to world history, is possible. In its factical being, Dasein always is how, and what it already was. Whether explicitly or not, it is its past. It is its own past not only in such a way that its past, as it were, pushes itself along behind it, and that it possesses what is past as a property that is still objectively present and at times has an effect on it. Dasein is its past in the manner of its being which, roughly expressed, on each occasion occurs out of its future. In its manner of existing at any given time, and thus also with the understanding of being that belongs to it, Dasein grows into a customary interpretation of itself and grows up on that interpretation. It understands itself initially in terms of this interpretation and continually within a certain range, constantly. This understanding discloses the possibilities of its being and regulates them. Its own past, and that always means that of its generation, does not follow after Dasein but rather always already goes ahead of it. This elemental historicity of Dasein can remain concealed from it, but it can also be discovered in a certain way and be properly cultivated. Dasein can discover, preserve, and explicitly pursue tradition. The discovery of tradition and the disclosure of what it transmits, and how it does this, can be undertaken as a task in its own right. Dasein thus assumes the mode of being that involves historical inquiry and research. But the discipline of history more precisely, the historicality underlying it, is possible only as the kind of being belonging to inquiring Dasein, because Dasein is determined by historicity in the ground of its being. If historicity remains concealed from Dasein, and so long as it does so, the possibility of historical inquiry and discovery of history is denied it. If the discipline of history is lacking, that is no evidence against the historicity of Dasein, rather it is evidence for this constitution of being in a deficient mode. Only because it is historic, in the first place, can an age lack the discipline of history. On the other hand, if Dasein has seized upon its inherent possibility not only of making its existence transparent, but also of inquiring into the meaning of existentiality itself, that is to say, of provisionally inquiring into the meaning of being in general, and if insight into the essential historicity of Dasein has opened up in such inquiry, then it is inevitable that inquiry into being, which was designated with regard to its ontocontological necessity, is itself characterized by historicity. The elaboration of the question of being must therefore receive its directive to inquire into its own history from the most proper ontological sense of the inquiry itself. As a historical one, that means to become historical in a disciplined way in order to come to the positive appropriation of the past, to come into full possession of its most proper possibilities of inquiry. The question of the meaning of being is led to understand itself as historical in accordance with its own way of proceeding, that is, as the provisional explication of Dasein in its temporality and historicity. Preparatory interpretation of the fundamental structures of Dasein with regard to its usual and average way of being in which it is also first of all historical will make the following clear. Dasein not only has the inclination to be entangled in the world in which it is, and to interpret itself in terms of that world by its reflected light. At the same time, Dasein is also entangled in a tradition which it more or less explicitly grasps. This tradition deprives Dasein of its own leadership in questioning and choosing. This is especially true to that understanding, and its possible development, which is rooted in the most proper being of Dasein, the ontological understanding. The tradition that hereby gains dominance makes what it transmits so little accessible that initially, and for the most part, it covers it over instead. What has been handed down is handed over to obviousness. It bars access to those original wellsprings, out of which the traditional categories and concepts were in part genuinely drawn. The tradition even makes us forget such a provenance altogether. Indeed, it makes us wholly incapable of even understanding that such a return is necessary. The tradition uproots the historicity of Dasein to such a degree that it only takes an interest in the manifold forms of possible types, directions, and standpoints of philosophizing in the most remote and strangest cultures, and with this interest tries to veil its own groundlessness. Consequently, In spite of all historical interest and zeal for a philologically objective interpretation, Dasein no longer understands the most elementary conditions which alone make a positive return to the past possible in the sense of its productive appropriation. At the outset, Section 1, we showed that the question of the meaning of being was not only unresolved, not only inadequately formulated, but despite all interests in metaphysics, has even been forgotten. Greek ontology and its history, which through many twists and turns still define the conceptual character of philosophy today, are proof of the fact that Dasein understands itself and being in general in terms of the world. The ontology that thus arises deteriorates into a tradition, which allows it to sink to the level of the obvious and become mere material for reworking, as it was for Hegel. Greek ontology, thus uprooted, becomes a fixed body of doctrine in the Middle Ages. But its systematic is not at all a mere joining together of traditional elements into a single structure. Within the limits of its dogmatic adoption of the fundamental Greek conceptions of being, this systematic contains a great deal of unpretentious work which does make advances. In its scholastic mold, Greek ontology makes the essential transition via the Disputations Metaphysicae of Suarez into the metaphysics and transcendental philosophy of the modern period. It still determines the foundations and goals of Hegel's logic. Certain distinctive domains of being become visible in the course of this history and become the primary leitmotifs for the subsequent range of problems. Descartes' ego cogito, subject, ego, reason, spirit, person. But corresponding to the thorough neglect of the question of being, they remain unquestioned with respect to being and the structure of their being. But the categorical content of traditional ontology is transferred to these beings with corresponding formalizations and purely negative restrictions, or else dialectic is called upon to help with an ontological interpretation of the substantiality of the subject. If the question of being is to achieve clarity regarding its own history, a loosening of the sclerotic tradition and a dissolution of the concealments produced by it is necessary. We understand this task as the destruction of the traditional content of ancient ontology, which is to be carried out along the guidelines of the question of being. This destruction is based upon the original experiences in which the first, and subsequently guiding, determinations of being were gained. This demonstration of the provenance of the fundamental ontological concepts, as the investigation which displays their birth certificate, has nothing to do with a pernicious relativizing of ontological standpoints. The destruction has just as little the negative sense of disburdening ourselves of the ontological tradition. On the contrary, it should stake out the positive possibilities in that tradition, and that always means to stake out its limits. These are factically given with a specific formulation of the question, and the prescribed demarcation of the possible field of investigation. Destruction does not relate itself in a negative way to the past. Its critique concerns today, and the dominant way we treat the history of ontology, whether it is conceived as the history of opinions, ideas, or problems. Destruction does not wish to bury the past in nullity, it has a positive intent. Its negative function remains tacit and indirect. The destruction of the history of ontology essentially belongs to the formulation of the question of being, and is possible solely within such a formulation. Within the scope of this treatise, which has as its goal a fundamental elaboration of the question of being, the destruction can be carried out only with regard to the fundamentally decisive stages of this history. In accord with the positive tendency of this destruction, the question must first be asked whether, and to what extent in the course of the history of ontology in general the interpretation of being has been thematically connected with the phenomenon of time. We must also ask whether the problematic of temporality temporalitat, which necessarily belongs here, was fundamentally worked out or could have been. Kant is the first and only one who traversed a stretch of the path toward investigating the dimension of temporality temporalitat, or allowed himself to be driven there by the compelling force of the phenomena themselves. Only when the problem of temporality temporalitat is pinned down can we succeed in casting light on the obscurity of his doctrine of schematism. Furthermore, in this way we can also show why this area had to remain closed to Kant in its real dimensions and in its central ontological function. Kant himself knew that he was venturing forth into an obscure area. This schematism of our understanding as regards appearances and their mere form is an art hidden in the depths of the human soul, the true devices of which are hardly ever to be divined from nature and laid uncovered before our eye. What it is that Kant shrinks back from here, as it were, must be brought to light thematically and in principle if the expression being, sane, is to have a demonstrable meaning. Ultimately, the phenomena to be explicated in the following analysis under the rubric of temporality, temporalitat, are precisely those that determine the most covert judgments of common reason, the analysis of which Kant calls the business of philosophers. In pursuing the task of destruction along the guideline of the problem of temporality, temporalitat, the following treatise will attempt to interpret the chapter on the schematism and the Kantian doctrine of time developed there. At the same time, we must show why Kant could never gain insight into the problem of temporality temporalitat. Two things prevented this insight. First, the neglect of the question of being in general, and second, in conjunction with this, the lack of a thematic ontology of Dasein, or, in Kantian terms, the lack of a preliminary ontological analytic of the subjectivity of the subject. Instead, despite all his essential advances, Kant dogmatically adopted Descartes' position. Furthermore, although Kant takes this phenomenon back into the subject, his analysis of time remains oriented toward the traditional, vulgar understanding of it. It is this that finally prevented Kant from working out the phenomenon of a transcendental determination of time, in its own structure and function. As a consequence of this double effect of the tradition, the decisive connection between time and the I think remained shrouded in complete obscurity. It did not even become a problem. By taking over Descartes' ontological position, Kant neglects something essential, an ontology of Dasein. In terms of Descartes' innermost tendency, this omission is a decisive one. With the cogito sum, Descartes claims to prepare a new and secure foundation for philosophy. But what he leaves undetermined in this radical beginning is the manner of being of the res cogitans, more precisely the meaning of being of the sum. Working out the tacit ontological foundations of the cogito sum will constitute the second stage of the destruction of, and the path back into, the history of ontology. The interpretation will demonstrate not only that Descartes had to neglect the question of being altogether, but also why he held the opinion that the absolute being cert of the cogito exempted him from the question of the meaning of the being of this being saying. However, with Descartes it is not just a matter of neglect, and thus of a complete ontological indeterminateness of the res cogitans sive mens, sive animus, the thinking thing, whether it be mind or spirit. Descartes carries out the fundamental reflections of his meditations by applying medieval ontology to this being end which he posits as the fundamentum inconcussum unshakable foundation. The res cogitans is ontologically determined as ends, and for medieval ontology, the meaning of the being of the ends is established in the understanding of it as ens creatum. As the ens infinitum, God is the ens in creatum. But createdness, in the broadest sense of something having been produced, is an essential structural moment of the ancient concept of being. The ostensibly new beginning of philosophizing betrays the imposition of an ill-fated prejudice. On the basis of this prejudice, later times neglect a thematic ontological analysis of the mind, gemutes, which would be guided by the question of being. Likewise, they neglect a critical confrontation with the inherited ancient ontology. Everyone familiar with the medieval period sees that Descartes is dependent upon medieval scholasticism and uses its terminology. But with this discovery, nothing is gained philosophically as long as it remains obscure to what a profound extent medieval ontology influences the way posterity determines or fails to determine the res cogitans ontologically. The full extent of this influence cannot be estimated until the meaning and limits of ancient ontology have been shown by our orientation toward the question of being. In other words, the destruction sees itself assigned the task of interpreting the foundation of ancient ontology in light of the problematic of temporality temporalitat. Here it becomes evident that the ancient interpretation of the being of beings is oriented toward the world, or nature, in the broadest sense, and that it indeed gains its understanding of being from time. The outward evidence of this, but of course only outward, is the determination of the meaning of being as itopox for all, 6f, which ontologically and temporally means presence, Anwesenheit. Beings are grasped in their being sane as presence, that is to say, they are understood with regard to a definite mode of time, the present, Gegenwart. The problem of Greek ontology must, like that of any ontology, take its guideline from Dasein itself. In the ordinary and also the philosophical definition, Dasein, that is, the being of human being, is delineated as Nein Zav, that creature whose being is essentially determined by its ability to speak. Cf. Section 7b is the guideline for arriving at the structures of being of the beings we encounter in speech and discussion. That is why the ancient ontology developed by Plato becomes dialectic. The possibility of a more radical conception of the problem of being grows with the continuing development of the ontological guideline itself, that is, with the hermeneutics of the dialectic, which was a genuine philosophically embarrassment, becomes superfluous. Thus Aristotle no longer has any sympathy for it, because he places it on a more radical foundation and transcends it itself, or vos of the simple apprehension of something objectively present in its sheer objective presence vorhindenheit, which Parmenides already used as a guide for interpreting being, has the temporal structure of a pure making present of something. Beings which show themselves in and for this making present and which are understood as genuine beings are accordingly interpreted with regard to the present, that is to say, they are conceived as presents of Ifa. However, this Greek interpretation of being comes about without any explicit knowledge of the guideline functioning in it, without taking cognizance of or understanding the fundamental ontological function of time, without insight into the ground of the possibility of this function. On the contrary, time itself is taken to be one being among others. The attempt is made to grasp time itself, in the structure of its being within the horizon, of an understanding of being which is oriented toward time in an inexplicit and naive way. Within the framework of the following fundamental elaboration of the question of being a detailed temporal interpretation of the foundations of ancient ontology, especially of its scientifically highest and purest stage, that is, in Aristotle cannot be offered. Instead, we offer an interpretation of Aristotle's treatise on time, which can be taken as a way of discerning the basis and limits of the ancient science of being. Aristotle's treatise on time is the first detailed interpretation of this phenomenon that has come down to us. It essentially determined all the subsequent interpretations of time, including that of Bergson. From our analysis of Aristotle's concept of time, it becomes retrospectively clear that the Kantian interpretation moves within the structures developed by Aristotle. This means that Kant's fundamental ontological orientation, despite all the differences implicit in a new inquiry Greek, the question of being attains true concreteness only when we carry out the destruction of the ontological tradition. By so doing, we can thoroughly demonstrate the meaning of our talk about a retrieval of this question. In this field where the matter itself is deeply veiled, any investigation should avoid overestimating its results. For such inquiry is constantly forced to face the possibility of disclosing a still more original and more universal horizon from which it could draw the answer to the question, what does being mean? We can discuss such possibilities seriously, and with a positive result only if the question of being has been reawakened, and we have reached the point where we can come to terms with it in a controlled fashion.